Got it. Hida, did you start that? Great, thank you. All right, welcome everyone. Today's session is gonna be about Agile estimation. Let's jump right in and get started. Let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Richard Chang. I'm an Agile trainer and coach based here in Reston, Virginia, right outside Washington, DC. In your chat windows, let me have everyone type in where you're zooming in from. So if you feel comfortable, type in where you're zooming in from. I'm coming in from Reston, Virginia. Roanoke, Virginia. Woodstock, Gaithersburg, California. Thank you from the West Coast. Awesome. People all over the country. Let's see, a lot of my background is in government, commercial, nonprofit, and association work. And my guess is in the session, we probably have folks throughout all those sectors. What we're going to talk about today really applies across all these sectors. Let me copy and paste my information into the chat window. So in the chat window, I'm putting in my contact information. Feel free to join me on LinkedIn. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. Feel free to follow our company, Next Up Solutions, on both LinkedIn and Twitter as well. Also, that very last link is a link to my personal calendar. So after a session, if anyone has questions, feel free to shoot me an email, or if you like, you can schedule time to chat with me one-on-one. I'm happy to chat with anyone at any time based on my calendar availability. Also, quick note, a bit of campaigning. I am running for the Scrum Alliance Board of Directors. So for any Scrum Alliance members, it's myself and two other great finalists. And so I appreciate your vote. But the other two finalists for board directors are great as well. So we really can't go wrong. A couple quick other notes is here at Next Up Solutions, we do offer a whole series of great training courses. We offer essentially the entire Scrum Alliance inventory for product owners, for Scrum Masters, for developers, for leaders. We also offer great Kanban classes. We offer scaled Agile classes, as well as classes in Agile testing, test automation, facilitation, DevOps. We offer a whole slew of training solutions. We also offer Agile coaching. We offer Agile coaches, Scrum Masters, leadership coaching. We offer assessments. Feel free to reach out to us with any Agile needs. And we have awesome software developers. We partner with the local universities down in Blacksburg, Virginia, and Raleigh, North Carolina, with Virginia Tech and NC State. And we have great development shops that can meet your software development needs. So feel free to reach out to us for any of that. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to talk about estimation today. And what I want you to think about is think about your experiences with estimation. What have you seen work out well? And what have you seen been some of the biggest issues with estimation? So think about that for just a moment. What have you seen work out well? And what have you seen been some of the biggest issues you've experienced with estimation? Think about that for just a moment. All right, and with that said, anyone want to share your experience? Something that you've seen had worked out well, or some of the biggest issues or problems you faced with estimation? But I can't have all 30 of you jumping up at once. So just one volunteer to kick us off. Anyone want to share their experience? Something better than nothing. John, what does that mean? I see your name in the chat. Something better than nothing. Team members following groupthink. Yes. Yeah. One person says it and we just kind of follow along with it. That's a good point too. Using hours. We're going to talk about that, Wendy. Hours versus kind of relative sizing. Yeah, many projects and activities don't even temp sizing. That's a good point. That's a good point. Yep. Yeah. Great points in the chat. We're going to talk through some of this. Let me ask you folks another question. On your teams, what units do you use for sizing? What units are you using for your estimation? Now, by units, some units includes hours, days, weeks, the time-based estimates, or relative sizing, story points, Fibonacci, t-shirt sizes. In the chat windows, type in what units you're using for sizing. John, I see your note here too. Mixed teams, project manager with skills, working with non-agile skills, and not everyone understanding how to size. John, that note about not everyone understanding how to size, we'll take care of that one today. So points from Kathleen, Fibonacci from Reed, hours from Melissa, hours from Carrie. We're working towards Fibonacci. T-shirt sizes from John, that's great. Story points from Rick. Awesome. Yeah. So we see a mix of folks using relative sizing like story points, Fibonacci, and t-shirt sizes. And we see some folks using time-based estimates. Now, with that said, what I want to focus on today is the concept of relative sizing using items like story points. And there's several reasons why we want to use story points. There's essentially what we've seen in the industry, especially in the IT industry, is we've seen kind of like we're noticing in the chat, a move away from time-based estimates into relative sizing. And there's a few reasons for that. Reason number one is a fundamental difference between work time and turnaround time, meaning this. Let's say that you had a piece of work that you know would take you 7 hours to do. You know this for a fact. It's going to take you 7 hours to do this piece of work. But the 7 hours assumes 7 straight continuous hours. You start at 9 a.m., you're done by 4 p.m. No lunch breaks, no meetings, no phone calls, no interruptions, no messages, no texts, no Slack, no other interruptions. If I start at 9 a.m., I can be done by 4 p.m., 7 straight continuous hours. So you have a piece of work that you know will take you 7 hours to do, right? 7 straight continuous, nonstop, non-interrupted hours. Now, with that in mind, let's say a project manager comes up to you and says, hey, you, how long is it going to take you to do this piece of work? If you know it's going to take you 7 straight continuous, non-interrupted hours to do this piece of work, what number would you tell the project manager? In the chat window, type in the answer you would tell the project manager. Project manager says, hey, how long does it take you to do this? What are you telling the project manager? In the chat window, type in your answer. I see anywhere from a day to 2 days. Interesting. Here's what we see on our teams with our developers. The typical answer is anywhere from 2 to 3 days. Anywhere from 2 to 3 days. So if it takes us 7 hours to do this work, why are developers saying 2 to 3 days? Why are developers saying 2 to 3 times? Is it because our developers are inherently lazy sandbaggers? Is that why that is? Why do you think developers would say 2 to 3 days? Question to the group. Why do you think developers would say 2 to 3 days? Yeah, good point. They don't know if they get other requests. Excellent point, right? Buffer, yep, very good. Things may take longer than we thought, right? Think of this. When's the last time you had 7 straight continuous hours to do something? Context switching, managing expectations. It's not the only thing they're working on. Can't code for 7 hours straight. Shannon, that's a good point. First of all, don't type for 7 hours straight. You're going to get carpal tunnel. Secondly, that 7-hour day doesn't exist. At some point, I'm going to get hungry, right? I'm going to have to eat lunch. At some point, I'm going to use restroom. At some point, I'm going to need to refill my coffee. I'm going to get phone calls. I'm going to get interruptions. For me to take a 7-hour job, it does legitimately take me 2 to 3 days to turn around, right? In fact, let's say here, I'm based out here in Washington, D.C. Let's say the Washington Commanders play a football game at 1 o'clock on Sunday. Is that game over by 2 p.m.? Is that game? Well, if it's the Washington, it might. If it's the Washington team, it might be. But the game doesn't end till 4, right? Because what we understand is actually that's not fair. The Commanders are won last week and they're looking pretty good. So what happens is there's a fundamental difference between game time and clock time, right? And so in our jobs, we know there's a fundamental difference between work time and turnaround time. That gets very tricky to work with because when people are giving estimates, are we talking about work time or turnaround time? And that gets very difficult because people might be saying it different ways. That gets very tricky to reconcile. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is differences in skill sets. I saw your note, Danny, that's pretty funny as well. Differences in skill sets, right? So if I have a junior developer and a senior developer, it may take the junior developer 20 hours to do a job. It may take the senior developer 10 hours to do the same job. That's why one's junior, that's why the other's senior, right? And so different skill sets gets tricky to work with because whose estimates should we use? The 20 hours or the 10 hours? Now you could say that, hey, just use the estimate of whoever's going to be doing the work. But on our Agile teams, we often pull the work more real time. And so we don't necessarily know ahead of time who's doing the work, right? You could, well, obviously don't go with the senior developer. It's way too aggressive. You could go with the junior developer, but what if there's someone on team even slower than that person? Also, if the estimates get too high, we may not win the work, or we may, the leadership may decide not to do the work, or they may decide to outsource it instead. And so managing difference in skill sets in terms of providing consolidated estimates gets tricky to work with as well. Finally, nervousness around time-based estimates. I was working with a small startup in DC, and what happened was they'd be asked for estimates, and they would say, we don't know, we need more details. They get more details. They would still say, we don't know, we need more details. They'd get even more details. We'd still say, we don't know, we need more details. What happened was, because they were held so tightly to their estimates, they got very uptight about giving estimates. Now, in their defense, here's what they would say. They would say, hey, product owner, if you want an hourly breakdown of work from me, I need an hourly breakdown of requirements from you, which seems fair, but that leads back into big upfront planning, which is exactly what we're trying to get away from. So what we saw in the industry many years ago, over 10 years ago now, probably closer to 15 years, was a movement, especially in the IT industry, away from time-based estimates like hours and days and weeks, into relative sizing like story points, Fibonacci, and t-shirt sizes. So we'll talk a bit about that. Now, I'm going to explain the concept around relative sizing. Scrum doesn't dictate what hours you have to use. If you're on a Scrum team, if you read the Scrum guide, Scrum's fine with whatever. Hours, minutes, days, story points, t-shirt sizes, Fibonacci, any of that is fine. But here's what I recommend. If you look at this complexity matrix, this is paraphrased in the work of Dr. Ralph Stacey. Here on the left side is our understanding of requirements. And so when our requirements are very well understood, very well aligned, very well detailed, and they're not going to change, and no one's going to make changes to it after they see the product, our requirements are close to certainty or close to agreement. But if the requirements are cloudy, gray, murky, or they might change, or people might start changing their mind as they start seeing things, you're further from agreement. The implementation here is how we build it. If you have the same people building the same thing the exact same way, time and time again, you're close to certainty. But if your people are different, or what you're building is different, or how they have to build it is different, or the technology they use is different, it gets further from certainty. If you are in the simple part of this picture, a time-based estimate, I think, is fine. If you're in the simple part of this picture, a time-based estimate like hours and days, I think it's fine. But if you're into the complicated to complex part of this picture, I would recommend doing a, whoops, let's get someone on mute here. I would recommend relative sizing, like we're going to talk about. What I'm showing right here is the Fibonacci sequence. In the chat window, type in yes if you're using the story point sequence as we see here. This is probably the most common sequence we see in terms of relative sizing. Yeah, this is basically a modified Fibonacci. So Fibonacci is a sum of the first two numbers equals the third. 1 plus 2 equals 3, 2 plus 3 equals 5, 3 plus 5 equals 8, 5 plus 8 equals 13, 8 plus 13. As a math major, I can tell you for a fact it doesn't exactly equal 20. But what happens here is with the story point sequence, they start normalizing at the higher numbers just so that they can make the numbers a bit easier to work with. Some of you may be using pure Fibonacci, which is perfectly acceptable as well. So if you use a pure Fibonacci, the numbers would then be 21, 34, 55, and so on. It's just the sum of the first two equals the third. Now, the way most teams orient to this is usually most teams, what they'll look at is about a 2 or 3 and less is kind of smallish. Around the 5 or 8 range is kind of medium-ish. About 13 on up tends to be bigger. Most teams, like Rick's pointing out, will have a point they won't go past. So Rick, I saw your note. Your point is 13, right? So most teams will have some point they won't go past. In the chat window, if your team has a point they won't go past, type that in the chat. 13 I see as a limit for Rick and Cindy. I've seen the limit range anywhere from about 8 to 20. I've seen it generally in that range, 21, yeah. So generally that's the range I see it where there's some number we won't go past. Now, it turns out this thing is way easier to do than it is to even explain. So we're going to do this together. I'm going to give you 2 user stories. The first user story is going to be the seed user story. The second user story is going to be the one you estimate on. So here's the first user story. First user story is this. As a sports car owner, I need to wash my car so I can look good cruising around Saturday afternoon. Now, the acceptance criteria is the car looks awesome, but to put more detail behind that, years ago, my family had a small 2-door convertible sports car, tiny little sports car, and I would wash it. And for me to wash it, here's what this would entail. I would get a bucket filled with soap and water and a soapy sponge. I would soap it down with a soapy sponge. Well, actually, I would fill the bucket with soap and water and a soapy sponge. I would hose the car down. I would soap it down with the soapy sponge. I would hose it down again. Then I would pat it dry. That's the job. Nothing more, nothing less. So anything else would be a separate user story. The job is filling the bucket, hosing the car down, scrubbing it down with the sponge, hosing it down again, patting it dry. We're going to say for a fact that is 3 points, right? And that's all the job is. Anything else, such as any tire stuff, any Armor All stuff, any waxing, buffing, polishing, detailing, anything with the windows, anything like that would be a separate user story. So me washing the car, the way I described it, is a 3. We're going to say that for fact. 3 story points is washing the car. We're going to say for fact, I'm typing in the chat. So we remember washing car equals 3 story points. We're going to use it as a relative basis. We're going to use that as a relative basis. Now, with that said, here's what you're going to think about next. If washing the car is 3 story points, the second user story I'm going to tell you, you're going to give an estimate on in just a bit. Now, with that said, do not write a number down in the chat. Do not say a number out loud. Do not provide your estimate until I ask you to. It's very important because, like someone else pointed out earlier, the moment someone says a number, it potentially biases everyone else. So don't throw a number out until I ask you to. But here is the second user story. As a homeowner, I need to mow my yard so I'm in compliance with the HOA regulations. The acceptance criteria is I don't get a letter from the HOA, but to put more detail behind it, here's what the job entails. My house, let's say we have a ½ acre flat, right? And the mower is one of those deals where you got to pull the string to start it. And then I'm going to mow the yard up and down, right? It's a self-propelled mower, but it's not a robot mower, so I still have to walk it up and down, up and down. We're not going to bag the grass. We're not going to rake the grass. We're not going to get the blower out or anything like that. Wherever the grass falls, the grass falls. Any kind of blowing, bagging, or raking would be a separate user story, right? Now, what we will count as part of the same user story is there's a small 3 foot by 3 foot square where the mailbox is. We'll get the trimmer out and do some trimming by the 3 foot by 3 foot square. Now, here's what I want you to think about. Don't say a number yet. Don't write a number down yet. But if washing the car is a 3, how big is mowing the yard relative to washing the car? That's what you're going to think about. Now, when you think about it, a couple notes. So washing the car is a 3. So if you think mowing the yard is smaller than washing the car, less time, less effort, less complexity, make a number smaller than a 3. If you think mowing the yard is a bigger number, bigger size than washing the car, give it a number bigger than a 3, depending on how much bigger or how much smaller you think it is. Now, a couple quick notes. Well, actually, before I get the notes, any questions I can help with, any clarifying questions I can provide before you give your estimate? Any clarifying questions I can provide before you give your estimate? Note anything like sharpening the blades or getting gas, we have to do stuff like that, it'd be a separate user story, right? And remember, washing a car doesn't include stuff like waxing, buffing, detailing. That would be a separate user story. Good question, Kim. Kim, the yard is a ½ acre flat, ½ acre flat. Okay. Any other questions I can help with? Flower bed or trees? Good question, Wendy. So I do have some trees and flower beds, but they're all like have kind of mulch around it. And so they're pretty easy to kind of navigate around. The mower is a self-propelled mower. You got to pull the string to start it. You hold the handlebar down and you got to walk it down, up and down, up and down. Self-propelled mower. So part of the first story is going to be hosing the car down, scrubbing it down with a sponge, hosing it down again, and patting it with a towel. That's me, the first user story. I have enough to ask him. Anything like getting gas, sharpening blades, any kind of maintenance we need to do to the mower would be a separate user story. Yeah, great questions. Now, as you think about this, a couple notes. Oh, in both cases, let's assume, Rick, in both cases, let's assume the conditions are shiny, nice, shiny, sunny 5-degree day. Nice, shiny 7-degree day in both cases. Okay. And also, let's assume the grass isn't is at a good size where it's not going to jam the mower as we mow it. Now, a couple quick notes. Oh, the car itself is small two-door convertible. We'll say it's a Porsche Boxer was what the family had years ago. Porsche Boxer, small two-day convertible. Small two-door convertible. Porsche Boxer for those familiar with cars. Now, a couple quick notes. See these numbers up here? Use one of these numbers up here. There's a strong chance someone in the room is going to use a number that's not up here. Don't let that person be you. Use one of these numbers. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, but Rich, I really want to use an in-between number. Don't. Because if you think about it, let's say I want to use, as an example, like a 6 or 7. There's really no functional difference. Just go a bit higher or a bit lower. Use one of these numbers up here. Now, also, let's say that you have never washed the car before. Let's say you never mowed a yard before. Let's say growing up, you had two things in life. You had money and you had people, so you have no idea how to do either job. If you don't know what either job is, use the question mark. The reason I say that is sometimes people will throw a 0. And I'll say, that's an interesting vote. Why'd you vote 0? They'll say, oh, I have no idea what the job is, so I voted 0. A 0 means I know exactly what the job is and it's already done. I know what the job is, it's already done. That's a 0. Sometimes they'll throw 100 or an infinity. We'll say, why 100, why infinity? They'll say, oh, I don't know what the job is, so I just went really big. 100 or an infinity means I know exactly what the job is and it's massive. If you have no idea, use a question mark. Now, before I have you estimate, any other questions I can help answer before you estimate? All right. So what I'll do is I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, show. And when I say show, everyone type their estimate into the chat. 1, 2, 3, show. Awesome. So it looks like I have 5, 8, 5, 8, 3, 13, 5, 8, 5, 8, 3, 13. All right, great. So it looks like the range goes anywhere from 3 to 13, right? And so here's the deal. Let's say all the estimates were 5, 8, 5, 8, 5, 8. It's not even a discussion. What happens? You simply, I would recommend going with the 8 and you move on. Let's say all numbers were 8, 13, 8, 13, 8, 13. It's not even a discussion. You go with the 13 and you move on. When you provide the estimates, if the numbers were one order apart, you would talk about it. Now here, yeah, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. If the orders are only one value apart, you wouldn't even talk about it. If the orders were only one number apart, you wouldn't even talk about it. Essentially, you're on the same page. Just go with the higher number and move on. Now here we do have a bit of a shift. We have anywhere from, I think at the low end, we have 3. At the high end, we have a couple 13s. All right. 13s. Any of the 13s want to explain why you said 13? Any of the 13s explain why 13? What thoughts around the 13? The size is a large lot. Size is a large lot. Good point. Yep, good point. Awesome. Size is a large lot. Anyone else want to jump in with a 13? Half acre, good size. Yep. All right. Yep. Never done mowing a car or washing, but operating feels much more complex, larger than washing with a sponge. Very nice, Danny. Danny grew up with money and people. That's awesome, Danny. I could always tell when I worked with you. So yeah, good points. Large lot, and it's just a more complex, bigger operation is the points around the Christine and Danny for the 13s. Shannon, for the 3, you said that basically it sounds, mowing a lawn based on description is a 3. Shannon, anything you want to kind of add on to that? Any thoughts around the 3? You can say it out loud or type in the chat, either way.
Yeah, I was trying to come off mute. Because you said that anything that would be outside of that scope would be considered a part of another user story. So if I'm not mulching, or if I'm just mulching and I'm not bagging or any additional pieces, then it's pretty simplistic. To me, a flat half-acre lot means you don't have to navigate off of the land very far. Outside of your little 3x3 space that you were talking about for your mailbox post, that was the only thing that maybe increased the complexity, and I kind of teetered between that and a 5, just for that piece. But outside of that piece, the way you described it, it seems like it's very black and white, very cut and dry, with very little expectations of that additional leverage of what would happen when you bring in landscape and hills and all the other pieces.
Yeah, that's a great point. So that's a good point too. Here's what's going to happen. So if we were doing this for real, Shannon was going for the 3, Danny and Christine would go for 13, and they would talk back and forth for a bit. And at some point, someone's going to give in. Someone always gives in, right? Because someone eventually says, you know what, I don't care anymore, getting hungry and use bathroom. Someone's going to give in. But in essence, it doesn't matter. Here's why it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is, are we going to do this job or not, right? Now, once you do the job, 2 weeks later, it'll be done. Here's what I recommend for all Scrum teams. Your estimates initially are going to vary. So what happens is, at the end of every sprint, what I would recommend you do at the end of every sprint, what you do is, in your retrospectives, you look at all the work you did and you look at the initial estimates for the work and you identify, was anything way off, right? Was anything way off? For example, let's say we did go with the 3. Let's say Shannon convinces us with the 3. 2 weeks later, Christine and Danny says, hey, everyone, in the retrospective, they say, hey, everyone, remember how 2 weeks ago, Shannon spent 20 minutes of our lives arguing for this 3 and we went with the 3? Well, we did the work and it was so much work. A half-acre up and down, up and down. I was in a full sweat. It took way longer. If we see this job again, it's closer to like an 8, right? Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe we went to 13 and Shannon says, look, we did the work and Danny and Christine do this every time. It's always, estimates are way too high. Up and down, up and down. We did it and it's a 3. If we see this job again, it should be a 3, right? So what happens is, the initial estimates are going to be a kind of a bit of a fluctuation, but use the retrospectives then to realign the estimates at the end of the sprint. So at the end of the sprint, if we see this job again, we know that going forward, let's say, for example, going forward, this job should be an 8, right? So now we know that washing the car is a 3, and now that we mowed the yard, regardless of what the initial estimates were, now that we did it, we realize this is probably an 8 going forward. And now going forward, we know washing the car is a 3, mowing the yard is an 8, for example. Now,
I actually noted that earlier in the chat to tell you that's exactly what we do, is utilize our retrospectives for whether or not we were guesstimating them right.
Yeah, that's
if there is any type of fluctuation, like if you have like somebody at the high end of an 8, we'll go with the 8. And then if it becomes the most favorable number of the group, and then kind of look back on it and say, okay, we're going to go conservative because we got somebody concerned. And it's not usually one outlier, it's usually an overall consensus, but that was kind of the benchmark.
Yeah, I think that's a really good approach too, because what happens is, your initial guesses are initial guesses, right? But like you point out, what you want to do at the end is reconcile those initial guesses with what the experience actually was. So I think that's the recommended approach. So kudos, I think that's a great way to do it. Because what happens there is, then you kind of use that as another kind of data point going forward.
Yep.
Awesome, Shannon. I'm glad you guys, glad your folks do that.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you folks a question. Who in their head used time? Who in their head said, you know what, even though this isn't supposed to be time-based, seriously, washing the car is going to be like 45 minutes, mowing the yard is like an hour and a half. So if this is a 3, I'm going to make mowing the yard an 8. Who in their head did that? Yeah. If you did that, nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Keep doing that. That's fine. That's perfectly acceptable. Nothing wrong with that. But here's what's going to happen. After a while, once you start establishing data points, you're going to start seeing the patterns, meaning this. Let's say mowing the yard's a 3. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Washing the car is a 3, mowing the yard's an 8, right? Now I have those 2 data points. Next, I got to paint the fence. So I have a fence, we need to paint it. I know it's a bit bigger than mowing the yard. So painting the fence, if mowing the yard's an 8, painting the fence is a 13. Now I got to walk the dog. So I have a dog. It's a little dog. It's young. It's curious, but it's actually a really good listener. And it can't drag me around because it's little. So if washing the car is a 3, walking the dog will be a 1. Or there's a web service we're about to implement, right? This web service feels just like a web service we did 2 sprints ago. Back then we said that one's a 5. This one feels like a 5 as well. There's another new web page we need to update. It's a bit bigger than that last web page we updated. We said that one is a 3. Let's make this one a 5, right? And what starts happening over time is you start seeing the work relative to each other. Any questions so far? Let me ask you folks a question. Let's say you have different types of people in a team. Let's say, for example, you have developers and testers. If I'm a developer versus a tester, am I just estimating my part or am I estimating end to end? What do you folks think? If I'm a developer versus a tester, am I just estimating my part or am I estimating end to end? Great, excellent answers. Good job, Vicky. Good job, Reed. It's end to end. I'll give you an example where this is helpful. So I was working at the Motor Vehicle Association, and they were learning estimation. They were doing, they're doing a good job with it. And we had a situation where we had this piece of work, and all the developers gave it a 5. All the testers gave it a 13. And so developers looked at testers and said, testers, what are you doing? It is not that much work, right? The testers said, it may not be that much work for you to build it, but for us to test it, we have to take all your, it's middleware transactions. We have to take all your raw numbers. We have to reconcile them against our formula and map them against a known good. It's very time consuming. Developers said, why are you doing it that way? Let us look at it. So developers looked at what the testers had to do, and developers said this. Developers said, oh no, you're right. For you to test through all this, for this to go end to end, this is gonna be closer to 13. That's a lot of manual work. And going forward, we need to convince the product owner to put in a user story for us to create a tool so that we're not absorbing this hit every time. By having it be end-to-end, it allows the entire team to get on the same page as to what the job is, and it creates better communication, better collaboration, and over time, better cross-functionality as well. Now, let me ask you folks another question. Let's say all the estimates were 5, 8, 5, 8, 5, 8, 40. Everyone's saying 5, 8, 5, 8, 5, 8, and one person out of nowhere says 40. What does that probably mean? What does that probably mean? Why did they, what is that? Why would that happen? What do you folks think? Why would that happen?
They may have more experience and
Yeah,
know some of the risks that are involved.
Yeah, it could be the 40 is the only person that knows what this job truly is. That's one possible answer, right? It could be the 40 is the only person that knows what this job really is, or what's the other possible answer? What's the opposite of that?
They don't know.
Yeah, or the 40 has no idea what the job is. But what that means is we're probably not on the same page. This also happened at Motor Vehicle Association. We're building out these web services, and it was 5, 8, 5, 8, 5, 8, 40. So all the 5s and 8s looked at the 40 and said, what are you doing? These interfaces already exist. We just have to create new interfaces to it. These web services already exist. We just have to create new interfaces to it. The 40 said this. The 40 said, those web services you're talking about, they're on the legacy platform. They're way too slow. They're never going to meet our service level agreements. We have to rewrite them all from scratch. At which point the team might say, oh no, we weren't aware of that. If that's true, yeah, you're right. It is closer to 40. Or the team might say, oh, we're fine. Team 2 modernized it 2 releases ago. They're blazing fast now. We're good to go. But when you have a spread like that, that's where the conversation's so helpful, because it usually means that people aren't on the same page. Any questions about this concept so far? All right, a couple notes about this. So what we did right here, where I said 1, 2, 3 show, that's called planning poker. So planning poker is a modified version of wideband Delphi. This is actually the technique I actually use. We'll explain the user story, we'll get everyone together, and we'll have, back in the old days when we were all in person, right, we would hold up cards, right? So the card might say, I propose this is an 8. That's a 1, 2, 3 show. We all provide our estimates all at once. In today's world where things are virtual, I think typing it in the chat window like we did, 8, 13, I think that's fine. There are tools you can use as well. There's one called planningpoker.com. There's another one called planetpoker.com. So there are tools you can use, but I think just typing in the chat window, I've seen work just fine. It's modified wideband Delphi version. And what that means is what you really want to do is talk about the 2 outliers, because 2 outliers are going to have kind of the edge agreements. And then based on that, you come to consensus. fact, quick story for you. Danny was there, I think, for this. So when I first started at the Motley Fool, I was still learning user stories I was still learning story points myself. This was a long time ago. And so I actually had an Excel spreadsheet out, and I had everyone throw up their story points. And I started typing all the answers into the Excel spreadsheet. And the team looked at me and said, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Well, I'm going to take all the answers. I'm going to try to find the average and the mean." And they're like, "No, we don't do that. You just talk about it and come to an agreement." I'm like, "Oh, really? Well, it saves me a bunch of work." And so that's exactly it. We just talk about it and come to an agreement. And so here, it's not about getting the mathematical accuracy. It's about the conversation and seeing if we can come to a consensus. Now, any questions so far about that? Let me tell you how we use this. So story points and velocity. Velocity is a sum of all the story points in a sprint, right? So if I can do, let's say for the next 2 weeks, I added up all my story points. Let's say I did 35 story points. So my velocity is 35 story points for that sprint. Velocity and story points are team-based for their own pacing. It is not meant to be a management tool. Raw numbers don't matter. You cannot compare your teams against each other. For example, if one team is doing 70 story points a sprint and the other is doing 35 story points a sprint, does that mean that the first team is producing twice as much value as the second team? Is that what that means? The answer is no. That's right. It is not, Carrie. You're absolutely correct. You can't compare teams against each other. Their basis of story points might be different. One team's 13, the other team's 8, right? Also, they may have different number of team members. They might be building different things in different areas. You can't compare story points across team. Also, some of you are saying stuff like 8 story points equals a day. Don't do that. The whole point of story points is to abstract time away from the equation. The whole point of story points is to abstract time away from the equation. So what do you do with story points and velocity? Here's what you do. For my velocity, what I want is a high completion percentage. So if your team says they're going to do 70 story points and they did 68, pretty good. If they did 70, if they say they're going to do 70 story points, they did 70, that's great. If they said they're going to do 70 story points, they did 67, pretty good. I want a high completion percentage because once you have a high completion percentage, then that means your team has a great understanding of their capacity. Next, I want a relatively stable velocity, meaning this. Let's say, for example, over the last set of sprints, my velocity was 39, 36, 38, 35, 39. If that was my velocity over the last 5 sprints, for sprint number 6, about where should I be, right? If that was my velocity over the last 5 sprints, for sprint 6, about where should I be, roughly? About where should I be? If that's my velocity of the last set of sprints, yeah, no, that's exactly it. Right in the mid to high 30s. Anywhere from the mid to high 30s seems very reasonable, right? If that's my velocity over last set of sprints, anywhere from the mid to high 30s seems relatively reasonable, right? Now, on the other hand, let's say my velocity was 17, 72, 65, 12, 92. If that were my velocity over the last 5 sprints, for the next sprint, about where should I be? Where should I be for the next sprint? Yeah. You folks are thinking about it. Exactly, right? Question mark and who knows is correct. We have no idea. I might be in the teens, I might be in the 90s. Both have happened, right? And so once I get a relatively stable velocity, then I have consistency, right? So once I have an understanding of my capacity and I have consistency, then I have the beginnings of predictability, right? Until then, until I get that stable point, right? I can't even improve. What I want to do first is achieve 1 or 2. And once I have 1 or 2, then and only then do I have the rudimentary beginnings of predictive capabilities, right? And then from there, I can focus on improvement and then restabilize after that. Now, the general consensus is it takes about 3 to 5 sprints for teams to stabilize their velocity. It takes about 3 to 5 sprints to teams to get a relatively stable velocity, right? Now, with that said, some teams will never stabilize their velocity. Right? If you can't stabilize velocity after 3 to 5 sprints, I know exactly why that is. If you can't stabilize your velocity after 3 to 5 sprints, it's because one or more of the following is happening. Number one, it's because you have people constantly coming in and out of your team. Or you have people spread across multiple teams, or your user stories are too big, or your sprints are too long, or you have an unstable environment, or you have constant changes in priority, constant changes in nature of your work, or too much responding to day-to-day requests. If you can't stabilize your velocity after 3 to 5 sprints, it's because one or more of these factors are affecting your team. Now, to address that, one or two, what I recommend is moving away from having lots of people coming constantly in and out of your team, and moving away from people being split across teams to having teams that are more together, more focused together over time. Now, that's easier said than done. Some organizations are kind of built upon kind of what's called matrix teams, where you're kind of building people in and out, but it's hard to stabilize when you have people constantly coming in and out. When I was at the NASDAQ stock market, and one of the clients we work with, Progressive Insurance, have invested quite a lot into creating these stable state teams, and they're seeing great benefits from that. So to address one or two is just create more stable state teams. If people come in and out here and there, I'm not as concerned about that, but I don't want that wholesale change all the time. If your PBIs or user stories are too big, break them down smaller. What I recommend for Scrum teams is no single user story should be more than about 4 or 5 days at most. So I know that this is relative sizing. So what you do is you kind of eyeball it and identify, is this going to take me more than a week? If it is, break it down smaller. If not, it's fine. And what most teams will do to kind of help equate that is they'll find a line anywhere from 8 to 13, or actually usually 8 to 20, where they won't bring in. That's going to help address if your user stories are too big. Because when they're too big, PBI, by the way, Shannon, PBI stands for product backlog items. It's the Scrum technically correct term for user story, but a lot of times you can think of them as user stories or your requirements. User stories or requirements. Good question. So what happens? What happens that really plagues most teams is they'll start a user story one sprint and finish multiple sprints later because it's too big. Stuff like that wreaks havoc on your velocity. Or your sprints are too long. It's hard to manage scope on longer sprints, easier to manage scope on smaller sprints. If your sprints are too long, my recommendation is move away from 3 or 4 week sprints and try experimenting with 2 week sprints to address that. Or you have an unstable environment. What that means in an unstable environment is things are randomly breaking all the time, and you're spending random amounts of time fixing things instead of building new features. To address number 5, to quote a great thinker in Lightning McQueen from the movie Cars, what Lightning McQueen said is sometimes to go faster, you have to go slower. If you have a highly unstable environment where things are breaking all the time, what you might need to do is take the throttle off, building new features and capabilities, and invest more into cleaning up your technical debt so that you can go faster going forward. Right. Now, number 6, you have constant change in priority. What I would talk to the product owner about is, product owner, are we really legitimately working off a product goal and a release goal and a sprint goal and working strategically towards that? Or are we kind of following the tip of your nose, just making things up as we go? Right. So that's one thing I would identify with the product owner is, product owner, are you working more strategically or reactively? That's a conversation with the product owner. Now, one note is if 6, 7, and 8 is the way my teams are supposed to be working, meaning that I am supposed to be in an environment where there's constant change of priority, or I am supposed to be in an environment where constant changes to nature of my work. And by constant changes to nature of work, what I mean is, for example, I'm doing a few sprints where I'm doing all my stuff in C#. Then out of nowhere, I have to do a set of sprints in Python, and out of nowhere, I have to do a set of sprints in Ruby, right? Because there's constant change in nature of my work, it's hard to stabilize. If that's the way I'm supposed to work, or if I am supposed to be a day-to-day request team, where more than, let's say, 60% of my day is day-to-day request, if 6, 7, and 8 is the way I'm supposed to work, what I would suggest is probably, if your teams are doing Scrum, moving away from a Scrum-based approach into more of a Kanban-based flow approach. A Kanban-based flow approach, a real-time kind of pull system, may be a better way to deal with 6, 7, and 8. Right? But if you can't stabilize your velocity after 3 to 5 sprints, it's because one or more of these factors is plaguing your team. Okay. Any questions about that? All right. Now, once again, you don't have to go to relative sizing, but what we've seen is this. Teams I've worked with that move away from time-based estimates to relative sizing, all these problems magically go away. Because what happens is there should be no direct correlation between time and story points. And because there's no direct correlation between time and story points, the work time versus turnaround time, that goes away. Our team averages 50 story points a sprint, right? It's just story points and abstraction away from time. So there's no difference between work time and turnaround time. Differences in skill sets tend to go away as well, because we could have a junior developer and a senior developer on a team, right? And what they can agree on is they can agree that this piece is relatively medium-ish. We both think this is about 8 points. Now, our ability to do 8 story points is different, but we can both agree relative to our work, this is smaller, this is bigger, this is medium-ish. So difference in skill sets goes away because it's not about how fast we can do it, it's how big these items are. Nervousness around time-based estimates. That same startup I was talking about in DC, within a couple of weeks of going from time-based estimates to relative sizing, we started seeing the estimates flow. We'd say, how big is this one? They would say, this one's about 3 points. This one's about 13 points. This one's about 5 points. Whereas in the past, that conversation would have taken weeks, if not months. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Hours, if not days to have, right? And so it helps address these issues here. Now, I see a couple great questions and thoughts in the chat. So let me add on a few more things to help with some of these questions. Right? So I mentioned earlier that there's no direct correlation between time and story points, but you can do stuff with it. And by doing stuff with it, let me show you what that means. Give me 1 second while I bring this up. All right, let's say we have a scenario here where my team's been around for a while, and my team is now averaging 50 story points a sprint, right? And now we can do, we're doing 2-week sprints. So we're doing about, normalized over a year, about 100 story points a month, give or take, right? Now, let's say I have a team of 10 people, and that means my normalized burn rate month to month, it's roughly $200,000 a month. Right? And what Ebenezer points out is good. What leadership wants to know is how much, how long, how much and how long, right? And so once I have this rudimentary set of data points, it allows me to kind of really give you kind of any kind of rudimentary budgeting and forecasting. Let's say we have a major new deliverable we want to do, and we kind of looked at it and we identified it's going to be roughly about 200 story points. If we know this major deliverable is about 200 story points, about how long will it take us? Question to the group. If we know this major deliverable is about 200 story points, based on these kind of normalized numbers, about how long will it take us, roughly? 4 sprints? Yeah, 4 sprints, exactly. Or what 4 sprints equates to is roughly 2 months, right? And about how much will it cost us roughly? About how much will it cost us roughly? 400,000 is correct, right? Now, a couple notes about that. One, this assumes our estimates are relatively accurate, which, by the way, not a safe assumption. It also assumes our pacing is relatively consistent with what we've done in the past, also not a safe assumption, but it quickly allows me to potentially throw out some initial estimates in both budgeting and scheduling. Right? Now, what you would want to do is kind of cohese that and refine that over time, but it allows me rudimentary predictive capabilities. It allows me for some rudimentary predictive capabilities. I get a little concerned when I share with this, because what we don't want is we don't want leadership finicking over the fact that, wait, that means each story point's $2,000. Let's talk about that. That's not the point here. These are data points we have in terms of our pace and our price. It's not about optimizing around this. It's about stabilizing around this. Because once we stabilize around that, then we have the beginnings of predictive capabilities. Does that help with some of the questions from Ebenezer and others in terms of kind of providing insights into this from time and cost standpoint? Let me show you one more thing. Wait, John has a question. Yeah,
There's
John,
more statement. I saw the question about consulting work, and so I was just providing sort of a little bit of a sidebar on different ways that this is done.
Yeah, great, excellent. Yeah, it's a little tricky because I can fix the. There's a great video from Heinrich Nyberg. I'll type it in the chat. Agile product ownership in a nutshell. One of the things he talks about is about, if you fix the price of a project, that's great. The scope just might, I'm sorry, if you fix the data on a project, that's great, but your scope is a little more fluid. If you fix the scope on a project, that's great. Your date might become a bit more fluid, but fixing both becomes very tricky to deal with. Now, let me show you something else here. I'm going to end with this. How did my team start with story points? So when you're talking about sprint number 1, here's how I get a team started with their initial set of story points. So what we'll do is this. For sprint number 1, what you do is you look at your initial sprint. Okay, sprint number 1. So you look at your product backlog and you identify the items you're going to probably bring into the upcoming sprint. Let's say we're going to bring in these top 9 items into the upcoming sprint. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to sort these by size. So let's say, for example, from smallest to largest. So let's say, for example, 4, 5, and 6 are the 3 smallest items. Okay. Then it's 1 and 2 are the next largest. Then it's 1, right? Then it's 8 and 9, and 7's the biggest one. Right? So let's say when we take these 9 items we're going to bring into our sprint, we have the team sorted for what they believe to be the smallest one to the largest one, and let's say smallest to largest. Then we'll find out if some of these are kind of relatively along the same range. So the team says, yeah, you know what, 4 and 5 are about the same. 6, 2 and 3 are about the same. 1 and 8 are about the same. And 7 and 9 are roughly the same. So let's say they kind of group like this. And then what they might say is, all right, if this is our numbers, let's say these are all 3-pointers, these are 5-pointers, these are 8-pointers, these are 13-pointers. So now initially we'll say, all right, these are 3 points, these are 5 points, these are 8 points, these are 13 points. So you do that in sprint 1. Then at the end of sprint 1, you're in your retrospective, you're going to say, all right, now that we did this, do we feel good with these as our initial numbers, or do we want to modify these around? So after you do sprint 1 in the retrospective, you'll say, looking back, with this being kind of our initial basis points for our initial estimates, do we feel good as this as our initial points, or do you want to move some of these around? They might say, yeah, let's move this around. 8 was a lot bigger than we thought, but 9 wasn't nearly as big. 5 was way underestimated, and rest looks good. So then after they did it, they'll say, all right, now we did it. We're going to use this as our basis point for the next sprint. And so this is a technique I use my teams to get us started on sprint number 1. Any questions about this? All right, going back to the PowerPoint. Like I said, Scrum doesn't dictate any of this. So from a Scrum standpoint, you're free to use any of these numbers that you want. What I showed you could do very easily for Fibonacci as well. Same with t-shirt sizes, except t-shirt sizes abstracts time away. It's extra small, small, medium, large, extra large. Sometimes they'll use a double XL, double XS, but you use the same concept. Now, once again, if you are in the complicated, complex part of this picture, I recommend relative sizing. If you're in the simple part of this picture, hours and days is fine. All right, any questions from the group?
So this abstract sounds like I'm still not fully convinced on the story points. So like when we had been using that story points earlier in my project, we had been still tying it back to the hours. So like, for example, we said 3 story points. What does it mean? Maybe 12 hours. So
if you're going to, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Keep going.
Yeah, so that's where like we had still had hours in the background, and then we were converting hours to the story point, and then we had been using the story point. So I don't know whether that would be the right approach, or how does it go?
Yeah, don't do that. If you're going to do that, just use hours. If you're going to do that, just use hours. Scrum doesn't, there's no law against using hours. There's no law against using hours. If you're going to do that, just keep using hours. The idea around story points is to abstract time away to help address these issues, right? It's to help address the difference in work time and turnaround time. It's help address differences in skill set. It's make the teams feel a little less nervous about giving hard time estimates to relative sizing. If your teams are fine and comfortable with doing hours and hours aren't creating a problem for you, then use hours. But if your teams are seeing these issues here, then I would recommend just taking a hard break from hours and doing story points. You don't initially equate any story points to hours. Over time, you will start seeing the patterns once you create consistency. But don't do rules like that. If you're going to do rules like that, just use hours. There's no Agile police that's going to come give you tickets if you're using hours. So, if you don't have a problem with hours, don't fix a problem that isn't there, right? But
Right.
if you are having problems doing hours, right? And we typically see it once again, based on this picture here. If your nature of your work is such where the requirements sometimes are a little bit iffy, and if, you know, there's a lot of, there's some unknowns in how we build it. If you're in a complicated, complex part of this picture, hours, I think, are too predictive. You want to do something that's more adaptive, like relative sizing.
Okay, sounds good. And that first issue which you had in the slide, right? Like if you can go back to that prior slide. So this work time versus turnaround time, what can you just a little bit elaborate on that?
Yeah, it might take me 7 hours to do a job, but from the day I start it to the moment I turn it in, it takes 2 days, right? So I might be typing for 7 hours to do a job, but between like my meetings I've taken all day and the phone calls and my coffee break and grabbing lunch, right? It might be day 2 when I turn it in. So it's 7 hours work time, 2 days of turnaround time. That's the difference in
Right.
work time and turnaround time.
Sure, thank you.
You're welcome. Let's see. I have a question on how sizing estimates and how to account for external dependencies when sizing. Well, dependencies slow you down and increase risk, Reed. What I would do is I'd factor dependencies out, meaning I'm only going to estimate based on what we do, and I'm going to try to create the cutoff points. I'm going to try to create the cutoff points based on dependency. For example, well, let me take a step back. One thing I'd like to do, Reed, is try to reduce dependencies as much as possible. So let's say I have a development team that depends on a test team. I would try to integrate developers and testers on the same page. If I have development work that relies on UI work, I would try to integrate UI and development on the same page. But with that said, if you do have dependencies, what you would do, let's say, for example, your team is still a bit waterfallish, where I'm on the test team, I'm on the development team, and there's a separate test team. What I would do for our estimate is just estimate for our end before it goes to the other team, right? So that's the way I would do it. But the ultimate thing I'd like to try to do is try to kind of integrate dependencies together. But if you do have dependencies, I would focus the estimation on our part of it in terms of what our team can control. I would try to focus the estimates on what our team control, but also make it very clear in the user story that this job ends right here, and the next job is a separate user story for the other team. Don't have user stories span teams. Let me say that again. Don't have user stories span teams. Break the user story off so it ends at the same team. So if 2 user stories have to work together, 2 teams have to work together, they each have their own user stories. They each have their own user stories. Yeah. Reed, the way you're doing it is just slower and riskier. The way you're doing it slower and riskier. Yeah. But what's going to be helpful is break up user stories so user stories are encapsulated on the same team in the same sprint. Reed, feel free to set up some time. You have, oh, actually, let me do that again. So Reed and anyone else, if you want to set up time to chat, I'm happy to do so. Except not today. I'm literally going to go to the airport. I'm going to Prague this afternoon, so not today. But here's my contact information. That very last link you see in there is linked to my personal calendar. So feel free to schedule time with me to chat. I'm happy to chat with anyone that needs to chat. All right, I have it. Oh, I have it as 1 o'clock. So thank you all very much. Round of applause to the audience. You folks have been great with your participation. And I'll stick around for a bit if anyone has questions, but everyone else, enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thank you, everyone.